Mary Carlisle is from Greenville, South Carolina, and holds a BFA in studio art from Converse College, an MS in arts administration from Drexel University, and an MFA in studio art from Lesley University. She brings over 15 years of experience in higher education and nonprofit arts experience in organizations with an educational focus. In recent years, she has been exploring alternative processes in clay, and her works have been in exhibitions including Critical Materiality, 3 South Carolina Women in Clay, and Boston Young Contemporaries. Mary combines her arts management and studio backgrounds by bringing clay into the community and into the classroom. Recent outreach initiatives include developing a tactile exhibit with activities to teach art history to the blind and visually impaired through touch and hands-on workshops for K-12 art teachers seeking to expand their use of clay in classroom. Mary Carlisle is currently a visiting assistant professor of ceramics and arts management at Converse College in Spartanburg, South Carolina.
As ceramic artists, most of us were exposed to this material first in a classroom setting. The necessary equipment, and often even the tools, were at our fingertips, so that all we had to bring to the table was a willingness to learn. When it comes time to strike out on our own, or into an existing program with limited resources, some of the cost can seem daunting. In my current role teaching ceramics at the college level, I have access at Converse College to a dream studio. We have facilities that allow us to mix our own clay and glazes, to work with a variety of firing atmospheres and clay bodies. I can expose my students to a little bit of everything as they look to find their voice in clay. But it hasn't always been this easy. My first teaching experience, although it too was at a college level, was in a much smaller program where ceramics was an elective and not an area of emphasis. My studio resources there mirrored that of a K-12 setting with a single electric kiln. While these two studios represent a range of access to equipment, they still have a common thread. I want to expose my students to as much as possible while keeping costs minimal to them. Lab fees cover the cost of clay and glazes, but leave little to build a library of classroom tools. To stretch every dollar each semester, I have continually added to my alternative toolkit. Some of these items are available in the studio as shared tools for the classroom, while others are swaps I offer for my students to make as they purchase their individual tools, if the cost of the required tools become a financial strain. The alternative tools kept on hand also allows me to develop cross-curricular collaborations with other academic programs to do mini workshops incorporating clay for the non-art major. And although I love adding to my tool bucket each year at NCECA, as I browse the resource hall, many of the items described in this presentation are also a vital component to my home studio. The alternative toolkit that I use was born out of necessity. First for myself as a graduate student, working in 2 studio spaces about 2 hours apart as I commuted between 2 jobs. It never failed that something was left behind at the other space. So I had to look around for alternate tools, often which came from my kitchen or my garage. Look around your kitchen. Spoons, forks, mason jar lids, spatulas, paring knives. The list goes on and on for the things that you can bring into your studio. Pull out your sewing kit. Needles, thread, pattern wheels, random buttons make great marks. Walk around your garage. Nails, screwdrivers, pieces of ductwork, the list goes on and on. And we all have that local store where everything costs only $1. Now that you have some objects, you can think about ways that you can alter them. A free paint stirrer from your hardware store can be cut up and turned into about a dozen different tools. You see a few examples here. Using a drill bit and then slicing it in half to make a great tool to smooth your rim. altering the form to make a cleanup tool. The list goes on and on, just experiment. A dowel rod put through a pencil sharpener makes a great tool for mark making. You can have it as sharp or as blunt as you need for the size mark you want to make. A hotel key card becomes a great rib. You can cut it to fit just about any form. And wooden spoons, easy to use as they are, but made out of wood, they're also easy to alter for your own needs. At the beginning of the semester, I begin with my students on the first day of class by exploring texture. They're always eager to get their hands into clay, even on that first day of class, before they have their tools. So I send them out around the building, outside, with small pieces of slab and little balls of clay to make their own stamps that we'll fire and later use as tools. Bringing objects from man-made objects, and objects from nature into the classroom as well on the second day of class as they continue to think about the marks they made on the first, continue to build thus. And you can see here some examples of the larger cylinder is a piece that was done with a workshop for teachers who just used an array of objects that I had laying on the table. It was raining that day, so we didn't have the option to go outside. The finished piece at the bottom is a piece that a student made using her handmade stamps that she did on that first day of class. I continually keep collecting objects and adding them to my basket of random things. Each group of students will use different objects differently. And we never run out of different marks from the same objects over and over from semester to semester. It also allows us sometimes to break the rules of function for what that object is supposed to be used for. And it's creative problem solving at its best to ask someone to make an interesting mark without any store-bought tools. Although some of them are store-bought, they're just not being used for the original intention. So one of the first projects we do, and actually I do a small bowl on the first day of class, after they come back into the classroom with objects that'll make marks and their stamps that we put aside, we start with a slab. It's a great lesson on how to roll a slab using a slab roller. It's okay if it's not a perfect slab in this first time as you make a bowl out of it, because you're not going to be attaching it to anything else. So this is their first opportunity to roll a slab. I have found that ductwork makes a great tool to cut a circle. My studio at home is in the back half of my dad's wood shop, so I'm constantly pulling things from his side of the shop to use in my own. And if you start with a circle, when you're making a bowl, you get a more perfect form in the end, because you're not dealing with that extra clay to kind of force in that a square or rectangular slab is leaving over your rim. We use wooden and plastic metal bowls for these forms. You can also make clay bowls to use and just bisque fire them. And then you don't have to use something like the fabric or the paper towels or saran wrap in between. But we're using plastic, so we tend to use fabric. Or my favorite thing to use if it's a smaller bowl are those blue shop towels you can buy at the hardware store, because they're very smooth and don't add any extra texture. So students can first, if they want to place the texture on their forms, they can do that, and then we put them into the bowls. Have students bring a sock to class that's lost its mate, fill it with sawdust or sand or rice, and you have a great pouncing bag that you can use to push the slab into the bowl form. It lessens the chance that a student is going to poke their fingers through the slab as they try to force it in. It also keeps you from getting thin spots, because it's adjusting to the shape of the bowl. So on the first day of class, we make bowls and we make cylinders before the students even have their tools, just using these alternative toolkits. Hotel key cards have become one of my favorite tools. I have a former student whose husband is a pilot, and so I get dozens and dozens of them each semester to put in a basket that we use continually. We used them on the first day of class, and a lot of students continue to go back to them throughout the semester, as I do myself. It's a great swap for a rubber rib if needed, and you can cut them into any shape. You can cut a notch in them so that you can use them to smooth a rim. You can cut an angle in them so that you can use them to add a bevel to a foot. A student recently brought in some pinking shears to cut the zigzag, and then it's very similar to a serrated rib that you would purchase. Dowel rods sharpened with a pencil sharpener, as I showed earlier, allow you to carve into the clay when it's very soft, and particularly when the clay is very soft, it works better than a needle tool. A vegetable peeler is a great tool for your rim. As I discovered working in my kitchen one day, I was annoyed with the shape of this vegetable peeler to peel potatoes, and discovered I was more than happy to sacrifice it to my tool bucket because it's great to smooth and get an even rim. You can use a funnel, whether from your kitchen or from your garage, after you've made a cylinder or cup, to make sure that you've brought your cylinder back into a round form. You can also add a flare to the rim, taking advantage of that cone shape. So looking at these, can you guess what objects were used as tools to add visual interest to these forms? All of them came from our alternative toolkit. None of these used any of the tools that students purchased. The large white vase used a ping pong ball. The sugar and cream pitchers used a combination of a broken pin, a couple of different sized nails, and a dowel rod to layer the texture over and over. And the bowl at the top was an object that a student brought in that she rolled her slab over to give that impression, and then just used a cleanup tool for the mark. The marks on the rim came from cutting the circle with ductwork, using the rim that has that little zigzag that makes it fit into the next piece. So students have learned now to make these basic forms. They can make a cylinder, they can make a cone, they can make a bowl. So then we can begin to combine them. Small parts go together and make big things, make more complex forms. Before we begin this project, we take a look at ceramics examples from the past and present. You can look at Greek pottery, classic examples of kind of stacked forms that you can make individually and put together. A lot of different ancient cultures you can pull into the classroom this way. We also look at potters working today, more contemporary forms, sculptural and functional, to give them ideas. You can make any form if you start with a cylinder, a cone, or a hollow sphere. And a hollow sphere is just two bowls. So they can use any combination of these. They don't have to be solid. They can cut them apart. But they have to use at least 3 forms and at least 2 different shapes for this project as we kind of build upon the knowledge that we've learned so far. Combined forms also are great when going into projects using alternative firing methods. With these soft slab forms, students again start with that base of a bowl or a large pinch pot. We look back at other making forms like Pueblo pottery. We can look at Lucy Lewis or Maria Martinez. There's some great video clips out there that show them using bowls to start their forms and building up with coils. But then I allow my students to make their own contemporary form. So we're not trying to make something that looks exactly like a Pueblo pot, but it's something more authentic to the student. I use strips of slab in addition to coils to help build the forms faster, and to have them, I found that using strips of slab, they're gonna be less heavy. Here I also have an example at the top of a metal trash can that I've turned into a mini kiln. Our pots are bisque fired first, and then we layer them in this trash can that has holes cut at the bottom to allow one, easier lighting of them, and if it burns out during the process, you can light it again, but the smoke circulates a little bit better. And then we do kind of essentially a trifle of combustibles, because different things that burn will burn at different great. So if you just use sawdust, a lot of times it puts itself out before it burns through the kiln. But if you use leaves and shredded paper, hay, sawdust, and depending on what you're using, you're going to get different marks on the clay. You can see with these examples, there's a couple of areas where there's just kind of a speckled look, and that's from the sawdust laying on the surface. Hay and shredded paper also make really cool marks. So an easy, quick way to do a second firing process, and a great lesson for the students that you can put everything in and do the exact same process, but every piece coming out is going to look a little bit different. The piece at the bottom was a piece that was put at the very top of this barrel and got some of the rust drippings from all of the firings on there. I wish I could make it do that on purpose because it's such a great look. But I've learned over the years there's things you can do to kind of make it do what you want to a degree, but it's always going to be predictably unpredictable. Raku is also very popular with my students as well. When we're doing the soft slab forms, I tend to have them make 2 at once because you need to put it aside and allow it to firm up a little bit. So we toggle back and forth. One, we either barrel fire or stagger fire, and the second, we Raku. So these are a few examples of those. And I have to give a shout out for Bracker for their portable kiln, which you can see in the small photo at the bottom. I purchased one of these back in December to allow me to take a Raku kiln to a workshop without having to rent a truck to load up the one that we have on a dolly in our studio. We fired between 60 and 70 pots in a school day. We got everything started before school started about 7 a.m. By the time the first group of students was coming through into their art class, we were about 15 minutes away from the first round of pots unloading. And depending on which age group you have, they can help with various components of the firing. Impressions from found objects can also add a unique surface to thrown forms as well. Here you can see a student used a screw, the head of a nail, and pennies. In addition to a couple of other things that I can't identify as predictably. And here the object she uses is less recognizable, still probably something from a hardware store, but provides an interesting series of marks on the surface in pattern and depth. And also a great example that you don't have to have glaze over every piece of a form to have the mark leave behind an interesting pattern. Thank you. That's true. I just recently purchased a few fondant tools to try, and they don't stick to the clay. You can use them when the clay is on the softer side and get some really nice marks. You can. I can, there's one thing where the barrel firing comes in handy. You can always paint them afterwards, or I've used wood stain on pieces before. It pulls a great mark. If you have texture, you can also paint over with acrylic paint and then wipe it off before the paint dries, and it leaves the marks in the surface. If you use black paint on white clay, it almost looks like a print. I've photographed some student work that we've done that way, and in some cases you couldn't tell that it was a three-dimensional object. It looked like a print. So kind of a great way to still be able to see some of the variation on surface without using a glaze. Colored slips might also, if you have access to make colored slips to add any pigments, you can do that in a bisque firing as well.
This will be quick. Thank you very much. It's very informative. Since I have some really old CDs, I just use CDs to roll the
Yes.
lines. But my question is with the, and I've used different things, but with the molds, what do you use if you use anything as a resist so that the clay doesn't actually stick to the molds, whether it's plastic or something?
So is that what do I use as the resist between the slab and the bowl? Yep, I'll use either scraps of fabric. You can buy in the paint section of the hardware store cotton scraps that are great, or sometimes I'll use old sheets or canvas, or paper towels, just kind of the school grade paper towels that you might have in your classroom by the sink work well too, without having to spend any extra money.
When I teach my intro class at the university, I tell them that, hey, this is the potter's toolkit. This is all things you want. Now, if you don't want to buy all this, these are the things you need to make. So I tell them what they need to do. Like, you need something to cut, you need something to trim, you need something to rough it up for scoring.
Right.
The scoring tool is the one that gets creative sometimes. It's the one that they need the most. If you don't have a scoring tool, you're kind of up a creek. But trying to get them to figure out how to make something that needs to rough it up. Do you have a comb? I've seen students take toothpicks and duct tape toothpicks together.
Yeah.
So the scoring tool is the one, but I'm also always looking for other things because, do you know any kind of unconventional scoring tool ideas? I guess that's always the one that I'm trying to have challenges getting the students to think about, okay, just find something to rough it up.
I think the most unusual thing that I've found is you can use, if you have, especially if there's a wood shop, use old hacksaw blades and break them into smaller pieces, and then you can use like the teeth of saw blades. And I'll repeat that into the microphone if you couldn't hear. Paper clips, folding those up and using paper clips to rough up as a scoring tool. Thank you, that's a great one. And it's inexpensive, like you said, if they break.
One thing I find works really well, especially for younger kids, because I mostly teach clay to elementary schoolers, where bringing any metal tools into the studio is not allowed.
Right.
What's a really good alternative for things like needle tools is I go and I buy like the cheapest plastic knives you can find at the grocery store, because the really cheap ones are really thin, and if you drag them along their longest side, just like you would a needle tool, they cut the same through any clay, and they'll even cut through thicker slabs of clay than the needle tool will cleanly.
Oh, that's
And
great.
Yeah, you can teach it to kids as young as 4 and 5 years old, and they pick it up immediately.
Yeah, that's great. Bamboo skewers I used one time too in place of a needle tool, thinking about grocery store finds. Thank you all so much for coming. I hope you enjoyed the rest of NCECA.